Welcome to the Monday Motivation Spotlight. I'm Lesley Kaplan, bringing you inspiring guests, either nonprofits or business owners, every single week. Today, our special guest is Robbie Sassoon, who I happen to know personally too, who is the executive and clinical director of Crossroads, an amazing organization based in Jerusalem, who provide essential prevention and intervention programs for Anglo teens and young adults in Israel. Robbie's been in this position since 2010. He made Aliyah from New York in 2008, and they're doing amazing stuff for Anglo teens, including a crisis hotline. They work with gap services. They have a mobile unit, and they have all kinds of outreach and programs. So sit back, enjoy, and listen to the amazing stuff that Crossroads and that Robbie are doing in Jerusalem. Welcome. We're delighted to have you here on the Monday Motivation Spotlight. I've had the pleasure of meeting you and your family and your wonderful wife personally. As we know, I used to live in Ma'ale Adumim. In fact, I think I hosted you guys for your first Shabbat in Ma'ale Adumim. First or second Shabbat in Ma'ale Adumim.
I remember down in the Gilgal, on the top of the Gilgal.
Exactly. 2008.
Right. Dessert was in the garden.
You got a good memory because I don't actually remember dessert in the garden. So cool. Do you even remember what we served for dessert?
No. I just remember that we did dessert in the garden.
Amazing. Yeah, that must have been the one. It was in good weather because we used to use that garden very often.
Right.
So let's go back to before Robbie made Aliyah, before your family made Aliyah, to Robbie as a child growing up in the US. You made Aliyah from New York. Were you living in the New York area all the time? Share with us a little bit about that, your awareness of Israel growing up as a Jew in Chutz La'aretz, and then we'll move to the next stage.
Okay, great. I grew up in the Bronx, actually. There's also Riverdale, which we moved to. But most of my younger life was in the Bronx, in an area called Van Cortlandt. And I went to, I was involved in the local Jewish community. Not so much where, let me take a step back. Where I lived in the Bronx, there was a much older Jewish community. And that was actually very meaningful, for me, because I was able to do a lot more as a younger person, one of the very, very few younger people in the shul. Whether it was lead davening or set up shalosh shadis or things like that, for all the, and older people gave me a real sense of responsibility. But most significantly, growing up, I was involved in Camp Mosheva and Bnei Akiva, and they did a real job on me. In terms of my commitment to Israel as an ideal and living in Israel. So I sort of always understood that that's where I would end up.
Right. And then when you met your lovely wife, Jenny, so was she on board too, or was Aliyah spoken about only after the years, once you were together?
No. Jenny also, from the point that I met her, we always had a intention to move to Israel. When I came back, I went to SAR, MTA. I spent 2 years in Gush and came back to YU. After Gush, I was on my, I had a 10-year plan from when I left Gush to make it back. And we made Aliyah, I think it was in the 14th year of my 10-year plan.
Wow. Okay. Amazing. But you got here, and that's the most important thing. And sometimes the planning doesn't always go exactly according to timing. Sometimes it's before, but you had that commitment and you came. So how did you actually get to Ma'ale Adumim? How did you hear of Ma'ale Adumim?
Heard from a few different people that thought we would enjoy Ma'ale Adumim. We looked at different neighborhoods in Gush Etzion or Beit Shemesh or Modi'in. And Ma'ale Adumim just felt right. It felt right. I'm not sure I would say this with as much zesto today, but I remember when Jenny and I first visited the mall in Ma'ale Adumim, we thought the bathrooms were very well taken care of.
So it's because of the bathrooms that you made Aliyah to Ma'ale Adumim, right?
We thought that the services were good. It was close to Jerusalem. We didn't really know anyone here, so we came in a little bit blind. But we're happy that we're here.
Right. Well, it's an amazing place. Let's just give a plug for the amazing Ma'ale Adumim. That was my home for 20 years. My kids grew up there, so I've got amazing memories from Ma'ale Adumim, and I'm still in contact with many people there. So let's move forward. In your first years in Israel, you were was it 2 years with the Land Institute?
That's right. That's right. I came to Israel without a job. And actually, the Shabbat before I made Aliyah, a friend of mine in Shul, Abe said to me, "So what are you going to do?" And I said that I wanted to work with youth at risk, and I wanted to run an organization for teens. And he said that was my ideal, even though I didn't have such a job or know of such a job. And I came to Israel. It's actually, I think, a meaningful Aliyah story, because I came to Israel and, we got busy until after the holidays. And, Jenny called me one day and said, there's this great place called Crossroads that they do exactly what you want to do. And they're looking for a social worker, which I am, and I applied and I had the first interview, and I had a second interview. There was two people that were in the second interview, and one was me, and I was already in my 30s, I guess, at that point. And then there was Leah, who was just out of social work school, much younger and much more hip than I was. And Karen, who was the director at the time of Crossroads, hired Leah as the social worker. She told me that she thought I was a little bit too qualified. Now, we all know that too qualified can mean one of a few things. It can mean that you're actually too qualified, or it just means that you're not the right fit and you're a little bit older.
Right.
And so I didn't get the job, and I found a different position at Lander, running, what's it called? Enrichment certificate programs in English. And I did that for about, a year and a half or so. Around maybe 20 to 30 different programs, everything from graphic design to real estate, studying for the real estate test, to web design, to photography, all sorts of different courses in English to help the young English or older English community sort of get skills that they can monetize here in Israel.
Right. I know Lander well, actually. I also did a course there. It was after your time there. I did one in Hebrew. So, yes, I know Lander well. All righty. So how did it actually take you back then to Crossroads afterwards? Because we didn't speak that much about it now, but I want to talk about it, is that you had a lot of experience working with youth. You mentioned a little bit, but we can maybe go into more detail about that, working with youth and substance abuse and everything back in the States.
Right. So there's actually two parts to the story. There's the practical part on the ground, and then there's sort of the backstory. Just to finish what I was saying about, applying to Crossroads, getting rejected from Crossroads, and then taking the job at Lander. I was there for about a year and a half, and it was good, but it was getting to the point where I wasn't feeling good, there. Really, it was getting to the edge. And I knew that Karen, the founder of Crossroads, Karen Green, she was finishing up at Crossroads, and she was looking for someone to take her job, and I didn't apply.
Okay. How did you hear that she was actually finishing off?
It's because they were publicizing that they were looking for someone to take her position.
Uh-huh.
And she called me and said, "Why aren't you applying for my job?" And I told her that you didn't hire me to be a social worker. She said, "Robbie, you're going to be an amazing director. I'd like you to apply." And basically the next day I applied, and the rest is history. But there is a backstory in terms of my commitment to teens, in terms of my commitment to working with more challenging kids, and including more complicated areas of like substance abuse and and things like that. I mentioned that I was involved in a lot of youth work and definitely in Camp Mosheva. And I always, looked forward to connecting with the kids that were a little bit more on the edge, the kids that were a little bit more rebellious. And what I found over many years was that at the end of the day, with all their breaking of the rules and pushing the rules to, going over the lines, I found that, they really just wanted to be someone to connect with. They wanted someone to fully accept them, for who they were. They wanted a real safe relationship. And and throughout my years in Bnei Akiva and in Mosheva, I often connected with that population. Also, when I was the youth director at the RJC, I did a bunch of seminars connected to, substance abuse and things along those lines for teens.
Right. Well, that's interesting. What do you think drew you to that population? What was it? Was it something you had experienced when you were younger? We're all drawn to different target markets, different populations. What do you think it was specifically?
That's a good question. That's a good question. I don't know that there's anything in particular. I wasn't a teen at risk. I was like very normative, a nice, good kid. Wasn't the greatest academically, but in terms of behavior, I was very, very normative. And I didn't struggle with, rebellion. It was the opposite. I had a number of friends a little bit who were more in that area, and we always were very, very close. So I don't know that beyond being involved in meaningful relationships is something that drew me there. I will share with you that in my second year at Wurzweiler, I asked them to send me out into the world to get, wonderful experience outside the Jewish community. And they said, okay. And they sent me to what they said was the NJC PD, whatever it was. And I didn't know what that was. And the lady called me and she said, "Do you know who we are?" And I said, "No." And she said, "Oh, we're Yachad." And Yachad works with developmentally disabled for the OU. So here I am asking to be sent out into the world, out of the Jewish community, and they send me to the largest Jewish organization in America. And I went to find my own experience, and I ended up volunteering for a wonderful organization in New York City called Safe Space, where they reach out to runaway, homeless, drug-addicted, drug-using kids who are also prostituting themselves on the streets of New York City. And I remember going out on their van that would go to the 5 boroughs in New York, offering support and services as a matter of outreach to this population. And we'll never forget the first girl that I met in Long Island City. I think that's in the Queens area. And there's these girls on the streets who were literally prostituting themselves. And we got out of the van and we offered, hot drinks and all sorts of information and any type of support that they would need. And my job was to write down their names. And the first person I met, her name was Crystal. She was 16 years old. And I just couldn't believe how young and vulnerable and in trouble she was. And I was involved in Safe Space for a little while to sort of supplement what I wasn't getting from the more normative work, at the OU. And I don't think that I ever would have realized, that, Israel has its fair share of kids who are in trouble, and English-speaking kids who are in trouble. And at those days, there was a lot more hanging out on the streets and involved in drugs, and maybe not to the extent in terms of prostitution, but definitely involved in all sorts of dangerous behaviors. And when I came to Israel over those years, I realized that it's a real need to help this population in Israel as well. And, obviously doing it in Israel, you're doing it for your family, you're doing it for your community.
Exactly. We're doing it for our people to build a stronger Israel and to help the Jewish population here. So let's talk about Crossroads and how it's evolved since you've been there. What was the type of Crossroads you found when you got there? And you've implemented, you're an innovator, you've implemented many programs since then. What you found and how it's evolved over the years.
Okay, in terms of the need, what I would say to you is that there's not great mental health support in general, within the system, which, let's say, would work within the Kupa. If you want to see a psychiatrist or a psychologist within the Kupa, you have to literally wait for months. And besides that, there was this subpopulation of English-speaking teens. Some of them were students, some of them were children of Olim, some of them were young adults who sort of just made it to Israel, who were spending a lot of time on the streets in Jerusalem. And they were out late, they were getting in trouble, they were drinking a lot, they were using a lot of drugs. And there was no one who was really properly engaging this population. There are a few nice organizations in Israel like LM that does outreach work and stuff on the street, but no one was reaching the English speakers. And before I got to Crossroads, that was a real niche of the Crossroads models that, we were offering this population that, most Israelis think are, no problems, so much money in the community. We don't need to take care of them, to realize that, actually I engage with 1,000 kids a year who need our help. At different...
I was actually just going to ask you about the numbers. So you're saying there are about 1,000 kids that cross, low pun on the term cross, but actually come across your channels and your organization?
100%. 100%. And it started on the street, and, a center was created. And when I came into Crossroads, the street was still very, very much a part of our identity. And we were getting, 40 kids every day into the center. And let's say throughout the year, we would see about 50 therapy clients as well. What happened over the next few years is actually quite fascinating, that we started seeing fewer kids on the street, and fewer kids coming to our Moadon every day. A lot more kids started coming for therapy. And it probably took me anywhere between 6 months to a year to realize actually what was going on.
What was the reason? Why do you think that was happening?
Right.
There was this change.
Right. So I think it's very, very connected to the world of digital socialization. It was like 2000 and I think it was 2007, 2008, where like a strong majority of the population had smartphones. And, a few years after that, it took a few years, until people started connecting to each other much more through digital media, much more from within their home than actually seeing each other in person. And
when we all know the pros and cons of that, and the problem, the amazing stuff, but the problems with the digital world.
Right. And what I learned was that, number one, people were, going out to the street less. And maybe to a certain extent, that's a good thing, because the street can be a dangerous place late at night. But let's say a kid that's struggling with their family, so in earlier years, they would get upset, they would, slam the door to the house and meet their friends on the street, but what happened, let's say, in the years anywhere, starting in 2012, 13, 14, 15, is that they would just, slam the door to their room, and then they have thousands of connections that they could make, online, whether people that they think they know or that they don't. And that led to a lot of other type of risks. So the flow into the center from the street changed, and we changed a little bit with it. We created more types of programming, like theater programs, music programs, that that people were invited to do in person, and that's better to do in person. We really upped our game in our drop-in center, offering things that people didn't necessarily have, at home. And what also happened in terms of the mental health world during those years is that mental health, in particular, issues of anxiety, issues of depression started going through the roof. So our 50 therapy clients a year, individual therapy clients a year, turned into now, let's say 250 therapy clients that we see. And the types of issues that we would see, maybe it was more, we often would send kids to like a rehab, for drugs, alcohol, whatever. Today, we may be sending kids more to the psychiatric hospital, struggling with their mental illness, issues, as I said, of depression, anxiety, really were becoming much, much more common in terms of what people were struggling with. I don't know if there's ever been a definitive study. There's definitely correlation between the onset of social media and people connecting to each other much more online than in person, and the issues of mental health really being, exasperated, and those numbers going, really, really high. There's definitely correlation between the two. Causation, it's unclear if it was ever proven.
Wow. So would you say with the combination of the world moving digital, COVID, which hit the world, and then, of course, Israel, the challenges that we've had in Israel for the past 2.5 years, but also challenges before that, especially with the war, how has that impacted your activities as well as the type of challenges you've seen amongst your kids and the population?
Right. So we actually, because we saw so many kids, and we also figured out different ways to invite people to the center, we started doing a lot more outreach online because that's where the kids were, that's where their families were. So we actually built our numbers back up in the day-to-day groups that come into the center. We could still, see anywhere between 25 and 50 kids, a day at Crossroads. Because we saw so many people, and at that time we were seeing 100, 150 clients coming in, which like doubled what we saw beforehand, we realized something was going, this was before 2021, we realized that there's something going on with mental health. And I think we realized it before most people realized it because we just saw so many in a short period of time. And what happened with COVID is it put that on steroids. And COVID totally exasperated the already spiraling mental health situation. Not for the first 9 months or so, but where there's a lot of lockdowns. But once the lockdowns ended, because during that time of the lockdowns, our center wasn't open. We were doing, Zoom, support and therapy. But once the lockdowns ended, I feel like everyone fell apart. Everyone was holding themselves together, and fell apart. And the very bad mental health situation that was beforehand, it got much worse. In the years following that. I mentioned depression and anxiety, but also the amount of kids talking about suicide. Attempting suicide, cutting themselves, which is a separate category, became something that we were involved in on a daily, weekly, level, dealing with that, very, very high risk of situations. The war had a similar type of experience where at the beginning, everyone was like this. And once people sort of let go, once people sort of got back to our normal day-to-day, we also saw a meaningful uptick in people struggling. Not necessarily struggling with the trauma of the war. There's a lot of it. And we weren't, we're based in Jerusalem. Most of our population comes from the surrounding areas. We do some Zoom work in the south and in the north, but not a ton of it. So less so from trauma from the war, but I think the war created a triggering situation where young people, I'm sure older people as well, but I work with the younger people, were feeling very, very vulnerable, more so than in the past. And that's, as I said, we went from, when I started in 2010, 50 clients, therapy clients a year, to over 250, today.
Right. Well, what is the average age of the kids? We call them kids, but the teens that cross your doors?
There are different programs. For most of our programs, which include our drop-in center, our therapy clinic, our theater and creative arts programs, the average age is anywhere between, let's say, 14 and 22, and it goes in waves. Sometimes we'll get, the older group, sometimes we'll get the younger group, sometimes we'll see them both, which is tricky because they're very different places in their lives. So we sort of keep an eye on that in our drop-in center. We also, over the years, and this is something that, I also had an opportunity to spearhead, we also got so many requests from people over 22, let's say between 22 and 28. And a few years, into my work at Crossroads, we created what I called 22 plus. That was a very vulnerable population. Generally, the people who were reaching out to us were in Israel, usually maybe made Aliyah by themselves, were very, very alone, didn't have much of a community, had some level of mental health struggle. And we've been able to take on many, many of those clients as well, primarily for just therapy and or job support.
Wow, that's incredible. So your age also covers chayelim and chayelot, the soldiers that were obviously, called up. Let's talk a little bit about that, specifically soldiers that you're treating, because I know they're meant to get assistance in the army, and we all know about that. Some do, some don't. So tell us a little bit about that, and I know our time is coming to an end.
Okay. In general, the Crossroads population of English speakers is made up of Olim, children of Olim, gap year students, as well as Benot Sheirut, Chayalim, and young adults. We've seen a meaningful amount of Chayalim, both on the street and through our doors. A lot of the Chayalim that we see are in the middle of serving, and they just need some type of immediate crisis support or trauma support. And that's something that we comfortably will offer anyone, as well as on our crisis hotline, which is a 24/7 crisis hotline.
I actually wanted to ask you about that because that's one of the programs that you implemented.
That's correct. That's correct. But we also see Chayalim like pre, and I would say we see more Chayalim post. That when someone's a Chayal, it's actually not so easy to get therapy outside the Army infrastructure. So we have a process that we communicate with the Army when something does come up of someone who's in the Army. If it's a one-off, we don't do that, but if it's a process, we do. But there's a lot of soldiers who were involved in a lot of the fighting, and whether it was through their service or miluim, over those years that finished, and we're really struggling with everything from, trauma to feeling, that their life doesn't have any more meaning, to sort of figuring out next steps. And they were like, obviously, when you're a soldier, you're very, very structured, you're very, very focused, and suddenly there's no structure and no focus, and feeling, falling apart a little bit. So seeing the Chayalim post-army is also a meaningful part of that population that we saw and we engaged with.
Right. Wow. You're doing amazing work.
Thank you.
The hotline, can anyone call that hotline? Any teens or only someone that's been through your door? And maybe just, if you have a number that you want to call out, if someone knows a teen in trouble that would like to use it.
Right. So it's very easy to remember. It's 050 hotline. So just, put the letters in, and you'll get to our 24/7 hotline. Anyone could call. It's made for our population of, let's say, teens, 14 through 22. We will take calls up to about 28, 29. If someone is not in our population, they're not English speaking, we will, we'll refer them, to, Iran or one of the other hotlines. But we could get up to about, a dozen calls a week. They're focused, in terms of, our community, and the calls could range to someone struggling with something that's going on at home, someone struggling with self-harm, someone struggling with thoughts of suicide. A kid could call us and be like, hey, I just ran away from my home. Obviously, we help them either get back home or to a place that's safe. And so it's really a wide range of people, that reach out to us, and a lot of different types of issues. And that's actually from all over the country. That's not limited to, the Jerusalem area.
Wow, incredible. You guys are doing amazing stuff. We've come to the end. 2 questions I've left for you. What does Robbie see for himself, yourself, moving forward the coming years? What is your vision for Crossroads? And also, how can people reach you? How can people contribute? Maybe just give your website, if there's a place that they can donate.
Okay, so all our information and the ability to support Crossroads and to learn more about Crossroads, you can find on our website, crossroadsjerusalem.org. That's our website. You asked me what's in my future and in Crossroads' futures. Those are like 2 different questions. Maybe it's the same. I find Crossroads, filled with meaning, and I wake up every day filled with, feeling that I'm contributing something very, very meaningful to our community. And as long as, that continues, I see myself, continuing to develop Crossroads in an organic way, as we've grown organically, over the years since I've come. And I guess in a similar way for Crossroads, we have a wonderful center in Jerusalem that has many different types of services. And, my goal is to continue making those services better, and looking for opportunities to expand them and develop them, when there's a real need.
Wow, incredible. Well, that's definitely a fabulous mission to have. So we wish you, our listeners and our viewers, continued hatzlacha. You're doing amazing stuff. I'm so glad that I chose to have you as a spotlight on the Monday Motivation Spotlight. So, ladies and gents, whoever's listening to this, look at the website Crossroads, contact, contribute, volunteer. If you know of anyone, an Anglo at risk, a teen, anyone that needs assistance, they're doing amazing stuff. So make use of their services. Thank you, Robbie, for being a guest.
Great,
thank you to all of you for listening to the Monday Motivation Spotlight. I'm Lesley Kaplan. Of course, a big thanks, as always, to our sponsors, to Eggert & Cohn Insurance in Jerusalem, and to Lali's Flower Boutique. And we will see you next week on the Monday Motivation Spotlight. Bye-bye.